The November wind cut through Cold Creek Valley like a cavalry saber, carrying with it the promise of winter's fury. High above the scattered homesteads, dark clouds gathered against the Montana sky, pregnant with snow and destruction. In the distance, the crazy mountains stood sentinel, their peaks already crowned with white, indifferent to the human struggles below. Rebecca Thompson stood at her kitchen window, watching the approaching storm with the practiced eye of a woman who had learned to read nature's moods the hard way. Her calloused hands gripped the windowsill, hands that 3 years of widow's work had transformed from a teacher's soft touch to something harder, more capable. The small cabin around her creaked in the wind, every board and beam a testament to her determination to survive in a world that seemed bent on grinding her down. Behind her, 8-year-old Danny sat at the rough-hewn table, his thin frame hunched over a piece of paper. He drew in silence, as he had for 3 years now, ever since the telegram had arrived with news of David's death in the Apache country. The boy's pencil moved in careful strokes, sketching horse and soldiers and distant mountains, the only language he seemed to trust anymore. Rebecca had built this cabin with her own hands after the town had made it clear she was no longer welcome in their midst. Bad luck, they whispered, cursed woman, the kind of widow who brings ruin to whatever she touches. She had proven them wrong, board by board, nail by nail, teaching herself carpentry from a borrowed manual in sheer necessity. But now, as she watched the storm approach, she wondered if their whispered predictions might finally come true. The wind howled through the valley with increasing fury, rattling the windows and setting the horses in the small corral to nervous whinnying. Rebecca had learned to read the signs over 3 hard winters, but this storm felt different, bigger, hungrier. The kind that could swallow homesteads whole and leave nothing but splinters and regret. She turned from the window to check their preparations. The root cellar was stocked with what provisions they had: dried beans, salt pork, a few precious jars of preserves from the summer garden. Not much, but it would have to do. Money was always tight for a widow with a silent child and a community that viewed her existence as an affront to proper society. The cabin shuddered as another gust hit, and Rebecca made a mental inventory of potential weak points. The roof was solid, reinforced last spring when she'd noticed some sagging in the southwest corner. The foundation was good Montana stone, laid with care if not professional skill. The walls were tight, chinked against winter drafts with a mixture of mud and horsehair that had taken her weeks to perfect. Danny looked up from his drawing, his dark eyes meeting hers with an expression far too old for an 8-year-old boy. He had his father's eyes, serious and thoughtful, but where David had possessed an easy smile and quick laugh, Danny had retreated into a silence that no amount of coaxing could break. He pointed at his drawing, a rough sketch of their cabin surrounded by swirling clouds. "Storm coming," Rebecca said, though she knew he already understood. The boy might not speak, but he missed nothing. His drawings had become a kind of communication between them, pictures that said what words could not. "We'll be safe in the cellar if it gets too bad." Danny nodded and returned to his drawing, adding careful lines that might have been rain or might have been tears. Rebecca felt the familiar pang of worry that had become her constant companion. How long could a child stay locked in silence? How much could one small heart bear before it simply stopped trying? The first snowflakes began to fall as darkness settled over the valley, fat flakes that caught the lamplight from the cabin windows like tiny stars. Beautiful and deadly, the kind of snow that could bury a man in minutes if he lost his way. Rebecca banked the fire and checked the lamp oil, calculating how long their supplies would last if the storm trapped them for days. Outside, the wind grew stronger, driving the snow horizontal across the valley floor. The temperature was dropping fast, the kind of cold that could freeze exposed skin in minutes and turn breath to ice crystals. Rebecca had survived 2 Montana winters, but each one had tested her resolve and left her feeling smaller, more vulnerable against the vast indifference of the western sky. She was checking the window latches when the first real blow hit. The cabin shook like a child's toy, timbers groaning under the assault. Snow began to find its way through cracks she had thought were sealed, forming small drifts along the floorboards. The lamp flame guttered in the sudden draft, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Danny looked up from his drawing, his eyes wide with fear. Rebecca moved to his side, placing a protective hand on his thin shoulder. "It's just wind," she said, though her own heart was racing. "The cabin will hold." But even as she spoke the words, she could hear something changing in the storm's voice. What had begun as a howl was becoming a roar, the sound of unleashed fury that made the previous winters seem like gentle spring breezes by comparison. The snow was falling so thick now that she could barely make out the barn 20 yards away, and the wind was driving it with such force that it seemed to move horizontally rather than down. The cabin shuddered again, more violently this time, and Rebecca heard something she had hoped never to hear. A cracking sound from the roof, subtle but unmistakable. She looked up at the ceiling beams, watching for signs of stress. The southwest corner, where she had made repairs last spring, was starting to sink. "Danny," she said, keeping her voice calm despite the growing fear in her chest. "We need to go to the cellar now." The boy nodded and began gathering his drawings, treating them with the careful reverence of treasured possessions. Rebecca grabbed what supplies she could carry in one trip: the lamp, a blanket, what food was within easy reach. Outside, the wind had become a living thing, howling and clawing at anything that dared stand in its path. They descended into the root cellar through the trapdoor in the kitchen floor. Danny first, then Rebecca with the lamp held high to light their way. The cellar was cramped but solid, carved into the Montana earth and lined with stones. It smelled of potatoes and preserved vegetables, the earthy scent of survival. Above them, the storm raged with increasing fury, the sound muffled but still terrifying. Rebecca set the lamp on a wooden crate and pulled Danny close, wrapping the blanket around both of them. The boy pressed against her side, his silence more eloquent than any words. They had weathered storms before, but nothing like this. This was the kind of tempest that the old-timers spoke of in hushed tones, the kind that came once in a generation and remade the landscape in its passing. Hours passed in the darkness below ground, marked only by the gradual intensification of the storm above. Rebecca dozed fitfully, starting awake each time a particularly violent gust shook the earth around them. Danny slept against her shoulder, his breathing soft and even, the trust of a child in his mother's protection absolute and heartbreaking. Near dawn, the wind began to change, shifting direction and losing some of its fury. The constant howling that had filled the night gradually faded to a whisper, then to an ominous silence that was somehow more frightening than the storm itself. Rebecca waited, counting heartbeats, listening for any sign that it was safe to venture above ground. When she finally lifted the trap door and climbed into what had been her kitchen, the sight that greeted her drove the breath from her lungs. The cabin was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed, but simply gone as if it had never existed. Where her home had stood, where 3 years of back-breaking labor had created something solid and lasting, there was nothing but mud and splinters and scattered debris. The roof had collapsed first. She could see that much from the way the beams lay twisted and broken. The walls had followed, unable to withstand the wind's assault once the roof was gone. Everything she had built, everything that had represented her determination to survive and thrive despite the world's indifference, had been swept away in a single night of fury. Danny emerged from the cellar behind her, his eyes taking in the devastation with the same quiet acceptance that had marked his response to his father's death. He walked to where his bed had been and began searching through the debris, his movements careful and methodical. After a few minutes, he held up a water-damaged photograph. His father in his cavalry uniform, serious and proud, forever frozen in sepia tones. Rebecca felt something break inside her chest, a sound like ice cracking on a frozen pond. She had lost everything before and rebuilt. She had faced the whispers and the turnbacks and the cold shoulders of a community that blamed her for tragedies beyond her control. But this felt different, final, the kind of blow that breaks more than just wood and nails. She took the photograph from Danny's hands, noting how the glass had cracked but left the image intact. David Thompson stared back at her from across 3 years of widowhood, his eyes kind and confident, the expression of a man who had believed that right would always triumph and that love could overcome any obstacle. How young they had both been, how certain that their small happiness was proof against the world's capacity for destruction. The November morning was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that seemed to settle in bones and stay there. Snow crunched under their feet as they picked through the wreckage, searching for anything that might be salvaged. A pot here, a torn blanket there, the small accumulation of domestic life reduced to pitiful fragments scattered across the frozen ground. Danny found his drawing tablet, miraculously unharmed beneath a fallen board. He opened it carefully and showed Rebecca the picture he had been working on the night before. Their cabin surrounded by swirling clouds, but with a figure on horseback watching from a distant hill. She studied the drawing more carefully, noting details she had missed in her earlier glance. The horseman was large, solid, depicted with the careful attention Danny reserved for things that mattered to him. "Who is that, sweetheart?" she asked, though she expected no answer. Danny had not spoken since the telegram about his father had arrived, communicating only through his drawings and the occasional nod or shake of his head. But Danny pointed toward the ridge that overlooked their homestead, and Rebecca followed his gaze. There, outlined against the pale morning sky, sat a man on horseback. He was too distant to make out clearly, but something about his posture suggested he had been there for some time, watching, waiting. Rebecca knew him, as everyone in Cold Creek Valley knew Samuel Mitchell, the richest rancher in 3 counties, a man who owned more land than some eastern states and who lived alone in a house built for a dozen people. He was a figure of legend in the valley, spoken of in whispers that mixed respect with fear. Some said his father had built the Mitchell Ranch on land stolen from farmers who could not pay their debts. Others claimed Samuel himself had fought in the Apache Wars, that he carried the kind of scars that came from seeing too much violence. What was certain was that he was a man who kept to himself, who ran his vast holdings from a distance and rarely ventured into town except on business. Rebecca had seen him perhaps half a dozen times in the 3 years since James's death, always from a distance, always alone. He was the kind of man who inspired speculation and gossip precisely because he gave so little of himself to either. Now he sat watching the destruction of her life with the patience of a man who had learned to read tragedy in the landscape. Rebecca felt a flash of anger, hot and sudden. She did not need his pity, did not want to be another object of curiosity for the valley's most powerful citizen. She had survived 3 years without anyone's help, had built her life from nothing more than determination and stubbornness. She would find a way to survive this too. But even as she formed these thoughts, she felt Danny shiver beside her. The boy was dressed for indoor warmth, not for standing in the aftermath of a blizzard. His lips were already taking on a bluish tinge, and his thin frame shook with cold that went deeper than mere temperature. Whatever her pride might demand, she could not let stubborn independence endanger her child. The horseman began to descend the ridge, picking his way carefully through the snowdrifts and scattered debris. As he drew closer, Rebecca could make out more details. Samuel Mitchell was a big man, broad-shouldered and solid, with the kind of presence that seemed to fill space even at a distance. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle, handling his horse with unconscious skill. His face, when she could finally see it clearly, was weathered by years of sun and wind, marked by lines that spoke of hard decisions and harder losses. His eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they seemed to take in everything without revealing anything of the man behind them. He was perhaps 40, though the western sun made it difficult to tell, with the kind of quiet strength that came from years of carrying responsibility. He dismounted when he reached the edge of what had been her property, tying his horse to the one fence post that had somehow survived the storm's fury. He did not speak, did not offer condolences or expressions of sympathy. Instead, he simply began to work, lifting debris and sorting through the wreckage with the methodical efficiency of a man who understood destruction. "Leave it," Rebecca said, her voice rough from cold and emotion. "I'll manage." Samuel Mitchell did not answer. He continued working, his movements sure and practiced, as if he had done this before, as if he understood the arithmetic of loss and rebuilding. His hands, Rebecca noticed, were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who worked despite his wealth, who understood the value of physical labor. Rebecca's fists clenched at her sides. "I don't need your pity." He stopped then, straightening to look at her directly for the first time. His gray eyes met hers without flinching, without the mixture of embarrassment and curiosity that most people brought to their encounters with the valley's most notorious widow. "You won't manage," he said quietly. "Not alone, sir. Not tonight." There was something in his voice, a certainty that went beyond mere observation. Rebecca opened her mouth to argue, but he pointed toward the mountains where dark clouds were already gathering again. "Storm's coming back," he said. "2 hours, maybe less." Danny coughed beside her, a wet, rattling sound that sent ice through Rebecca's veins. She turned to see her son's lips were now definitely blue, his small frame shaking with cold that was becoming dangerous. Pride was a luxury she could afford when only her own life was at stake. With Danny to consider, stubborn independence became something closer to criminal negligence. She looked back at Samuel Mitchell, searching his weathered face for any sign of condescension or pity. Instead, she found only fact, presented without judgment or expectation. The storm was coming. They would not survive it in the open. These were simply the realities of life in Montana territory, as immutable as the seasons or the sunrise. "One night," she said, the words coming out like splinters of ice. He nodded once, a sharp movement that might have been agreement or simply acknowledgement. "Get the boy, I'll bring the wagon." Rebecca wrapped Danny in the torn blanket they had salvaged and held him close as Samuel Mitchell walked back to his horse. She watched him mount with fluid grace and ride toward the ridge, where she now noticed a wagon waited, loaded with supplies she had not seen from the valley floor. He moved like a man who had planned for this moment, who had been prepared for her need before she had acknowledged it herself. She did not know why he had come, did not know why he had been watching from the ridge, or why he offered help to a woman the rest of the valley had written off as cursed. But when the first snowflakes of the new storm began to fall, settling on Danny's pale cheeks like cold tears, she found herself grateful despite her pride. Out here on the edge of civilization, pride was indeed a luxury. Staying alive was not. The wagon appeared at the bottom of the ridge, drawn by two massive draft horses that moved through the snow with the patient strength of animals bred for hard work. Samuel Mitchell handled the team with the same quiet competence he had shown in everything else, guiding them through the debris field to where Rebecca and Danny waited. The wagon bed was loaded with supplies, blankets, food, tools, and what looked like enough building materials to construct a small house. Rebecca stared at the carefully organized cargo, a suspicion forming in the back of her mind. This was not the random collection of items a man might grab in response to sudden need. This was the deliberate preparation of someone who had known this moment would come. "You were ready for this," she said as Samuel climbed down from the driver's seat. He did not answer immediately, instead focusing on settling Danny into the wagon bed and wrapping him in warm wool blankets. The boy's shivering began to subside almost immediately, and some color returned to his pale cheeks. Only when he was satisfied that Danny was warm did Samuel turn his attention back to Rebecca. "I've been ready for 3 years, he said simply. The words hung in the cold air between them, heavy with implications that Rebecca was not sure she wanted to understand. 3 years, since James's death, since she had become the valley's most talked about widow, since she had built her life from nothing and learned to survive alone. "Why, besties?" She asked. Samuel's gray eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something flicker in their depths. Pain, perhaps, or guilt, or something deeper and more complicated than either. "Because I owed David that much," he said quietly. Before Rebecca could ask what he meant, the wind began to pick up again, driving fresh snow across the valley floor with increasing fury. Samuel helped her into the wagon, his touch careful and respectful, and climbed up beside her on the driver's seat. The horses leaned into their harness, and the wagon began to move toward the distant buildings of the Mitchell Ranch. As they drove through the gathering storm, Rebecca found herself studying the man beside her. Samuel Mitchell was a mystery that the entire valley had spent years trying to solve. He had appeared in Cold Creek 5 years ago with enough money to buy the largest ranch in 3 counties, but no one knew where the wealth had come from. He spoke little, socialized less, and conducted his business through intermediaries whenever possible. The only certain thing about him was his connection to the military. His posture, his way of moving, his habit of scanning the horizon for threats all marked him as a former soldier. Some said he had served in the Civil War, others that he had been with Custer or Crook in the Indian campaigns. But Samuel himself had never confirmed or denied any of the stories, preferring to let speculation fill the silence he maintained about his past. Now, driving through the storm with practiced ease, he seemed less mysterious than simply careful. A man who had learned to read weather and terrain and human nature with equal skill. A man who planned for contingencies and prepared for disasters. A man who had been watching and waiting for 3 years for the moment when James Thompson's widow would need help she could not refuse. The Mitchell ranch house appeared through the swirling snow like something from a fever dream. It was massive, built in the territorial style with deep porches and tall windows, large enough to house a dozen families. But the windows were dark except for a few rooms, and Rebecca could see why the local gossip spoke of Samuel Mitchell as a man who lived alone in a house meant for generations. The barn, however, was a different story. It glowed with warm lamplight, and Rebecca could see horses in the stalls, their coats gleaming with health and careful attention. Samuel drove the wagon directly to the barn doors, which stood open as if he had known exactly when they would arrive. Inside, the barn was a revelation. It was enormous, built to house dozens of horses, but only 3 occupied the carefully maintained stalls. Every tool hung in its designated place. Every bale of hay was stacked with military precision. This was the domain of a man who found comfort in order, who imposed structure on his environment as a way of imposing structure on himself. Samuel unhitched the horses with quick efficiency while Rebecca helped Danny down from the wagon. The boy looked around the barn with wide eyes, taking in the size and organization with the careful attention he brought to everything new. He pointed at the horses, then looked up at Rebecca with something that might have been excitement. "They're beautiful," she said, following his gaze to the 3 animals in their stalls. They were indeed magnificent. A black stallion that must have stood 17 hands, a chestnut mare with intelligent eyes, and a smaller horse that might have been bred for speed rather than strength. Each was clearly the product of careful breeding and meticulous care. Samuel finished with the team and moved to the far corner of the barn where an old cast-iron stove sat surrounded by bales of hay arranged like furniture. Within minutes, he had coaxed flames from the cold iron, and warmth began to push back the chill that seemed to have settled in Rebecca's bones. She watched him work, noting the practiced efficiency of his movements, the way he seemed to know exactly where everything was located. He laid out wool blankets on a bed of clean hay, set out food and water without being asked, prepared a space for them as if he had done this before. Everything arranged with the same military precision that marked the rest of the barn, everything ready as if he had been expecting them. Danny pulled away from Rebecca and crept toward the stove, his hands outstretched toward the warmth. His fingers were still pale from cold, but they no longer had the dangerous blue tinge that had frightened her. Samuel watched the boy for a moment, then walked to a wooden chest along the far wall. He returned with a heavy coat, adult-sized but warm, and draped it over Danny's thin shoulders without a word. The boy looked up at him with what did by serious eyes. "Thank you, Mr. he began, then stopped, his voice trailing off as if he had surprised himself by speaking. Samuel froze, his jaw working as if the words had struck something deep and painful. He stared down at Danny for a long moment, something like recognition flickering in his gray eyes. Then he nodded once, sharp and sudden, and turned toward the barn door. "Stove stays lit," he said, his voice rougher than it had been before. "Don't open the door after dark. Wolves come down from the hills when it snows." Danny nodded with the solemnity of a soldier receiving orders. Samuel paused in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the swirling snow beyond. He seemed to be weighing words, considering something important. But in the end, he simply stepped out into the storm without looking back. "Wait," Rebecca called after him. He stopped but did not turn around. She wanted to thank him, wanted to ask why he had been prepared for this moment, why he spoke of owing her dead husband. What connection existed between Samuel Mitchell and James Thompson that could explain 3 years of distant watching and perfectly timed rescue? But the words caught in her throat, tangled up with pride and confusion and the strange certainty that asking those questions would change something fundamental between them. "One night," she said instead. "Just one." Samuel's shoulders shifted, a movement that might have been a shrug or might have been something deeper. "Take as long as you need," he said quietly. Then he was gone, swallowed by the storm. Rebecca stood in the center of the barn, her son wrapped in a stranger's coat, warmth finally beginning to seep into her frozen skin. Through a gap in the barn wall, she watched Samuel Mitchell cross the yard toward the dark house. He walked like a man carrying weight that no one else could see, like a man leaving something behind that he could not bear to carry anymore. She pulled Danny close and settled beside the fire, but sleep would not come. Instead, she found herself staring at the carefully organized barn around them, reading stories in the precision of the arrangement, the quality of the tools, the obvious care that had gone into creating this space. A man's barn, she had learned, told you more about him than his words ever would. And Samuel Mitchell's barn spoke of loneliness, preparation, and the kind of patient waiting that came from carrying guilt too heavy to put down. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the barn, surrounded by warmth and safety, Rebecca began to wonder what debt Samuel Mitchell thought he owed to a dead cavalry officer, and what payment he expected to make to a widow and her silent son. The fire crackled in the stove, casting dancing shadows on the barn walls, and Danny finally slept peacefully for the first time since the original storm had destroyed their world. But Rebecca remained awake, watching the flames and wondering what tomorrow would bring, and whether the mysterious rancher who had rescued them was salvation or simply a different kind of storm altogether. As the wind howled outside and the snow piled against the barn walls, she held her sleeping son close and tried not to think about how good it felt to not be alone in the face of disaster. How dangerous it might be to grow accustomed to safety she had not earned and warmth she could not repay. In the morning, she would have to face whatever came next. But for now, in the circle of warmth and light that Samuel Mitchell had provided, she allowed herself to simply be grateful that they had survived to see another day. The storm would end, as all storms did. But Rebecca had the growing certainty that its consequences would reshape her world in ways she could not yet imagine. Dawn came gray and cold to the Mitchell ranch, filtering through the barn windows like weak tea. Rebecca woke to the sound of wagon wheels on frozen ground, disoriented for a moment before memory crashed back with brutal clarity. The storm, the destruction, the mysterious rancher who had appeared like some frontier guardian angel when all seemed lost. She sat up carefully, not wanting to wake Danny, who still slept, curled in Samuel Mitchell's oversized coat like a small animal seeking warmth. Through the barn's open door, she could see their rescuer unloading timber from a flatbed wagon, his movements efficient and purposeful in the pale morning light. Stack after stack of pine planks emerged from the wagon bed, along with bundles of nails that gleamed like silver in the frost, and rolls of tar paper that would serve to seal a roof against Montana's unforgiving weather. The sharp scent of fresh-cut lumber filled the cold air, cutting through the familiar barn smells of hay and horses. It was a smell that spoke of possibility and new beginnings, of human determination to impose order on the chaos that nature seemed determined to create. Samuel worked without acknowledging her presence, his muscles moving beneath his worn flannel shirt, with the kind of enduring strength that came not from youth, but from decades of hard labor under the western sun. This was a man who understood the weight of responsibility, who had learned that survival often depended on preparation and the willingness to work when others might rest. His movements had the methodical precision of someone who had learned to read weather and terrain and human nature with equal skill, who planned for contingencies and prepared for disasters with the thoroughness of a military campaign. Rebecca stepped outside, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air that seemed to crystallize and fall like tiny diamonds. Frost covered everything in a white shroud, transforming the familiar landscape into something that belonged more to fairy tales than to the harsh realities of frontier life. But beneath the beauty lay the practical concerns that could mean the difference between life and death in this unforgiving country. Food, shelter, warmth, the basic necessities that civilized people took for granted, but that demanded constant attention out here on the edge of the world. The silence of the morning was broken only by the sound of Samuel's boots on frozen ground and the occasional snort from one of his horses. It was the kind of profound quiet that city dwellers never experienced, the absence of human noise that made every sound seem amplified and significant. In this silence, Rebecca could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of decisions that needed to be made and consequences that would ripple through her life like stones dropped in still water. "We'll rebuild your place," Samuel said without looking up from his work, his voice carrying no emotion, just the flat certainty of a man stating facts as immutable as sunrise. Barnes got room while we work. The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow, carrying her back 3 years to the aftermath of James's death, when the mine collapse had shattered more than just stone and timber. She remembered standing in Henderson's Mercantile, watching Mrs. Adelaide's face transform from sympathy to something colder when the widow's pension proved insufficient for her mounting bills. Remembered the parents who had pulled their children from her classroom one by one, whispering that bad luck was contagious, that some women carried darkness with them wherever they went like a plague. She had learned then that charity was a double-edged sword, that accepting help meant accepting judgment, accepting the subtle erosion of dignity that came with dependence on others' goodwill. She had sworn never to put herself in that position again, had taught herself carpentry from a borrowed manual, and built her cabin board by board rather than accept the kind of help that came with strings and expectations and the gradual loss of self-respect. Rebecca watched Samuel work with growing admiration. His movements were economical, each gesture serving a purpose. When he cut timber, there was no wasted motion. When he drove nails, each strike was precise. It was the competence of a man who had learned that mistakes in frontier life could be deadly. "I can't pay you," she said, the words sharp in the morning air, cutting through the careful politeness that frontier society demanded even between strangers. "Didn't ask you to," Samuel replied, hefting another bundle of lumber with practiced ease, his scarred hands gripping the wood with the confidence of long familiarity. "Then why?" He paused in his work, setting down the lumber and straightening to his full height. His gray eyes met hers with an intensity that made her want to look away, that seemed to see through the careful walls she had built around herself over 3 years of solitary struggle. There was something in his gaze that spoke of shared understanding, of recognition between two people who had learned hard lessons about survival and self-reliance. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. Rebecca felt anger flare in her chest, hot and sudden as a flash fire. The right thing. As if helping her was some kind of moral obligation, some burden that decent men shouldered when confronted with widows and orphans. As if she was nothing more than an object of pity, a problem to be solved rather than a person capable of solving her own problems. She had heard those words before, usually from people who wanted to feel good about themselves, while simultaneously reminding her of her place in their carefully ordered world. "I won't be anyone's charity case," she said, her voice carrying the edge that had developed over 3 years of fighting for every scrap of respect and independence. For the first time since she had met him, Samuel Mitchell smiled. It was a small expression, barely visible at the corners of his mouth, but it transformed his weathered face in a way that made her heart skip unexpectedly. The smile suggested secrets, shared understanding, perhaps even approval. "Good, huh?" he said, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there moments before. "Neither would I." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Rebecca studied his face, looking for signs of mockery or condescension, but found only what appeared to be genuine respect. It was a foreign feeling after 3 years of being treated as either an object of pity or a source of barely contained scandal. To be seen as an equal by someone of Samuel Mitchell's standing in the community was unexpected enough to leave her momentarily speechless. Danny appeared in the barn doorway then, hair sticking up in all directions from sleep, Samuel's coat trailing behind him like the train of a royal robe. The boy's thin frame was almost lost in the adult-sized garment, but there was something dignified about the way he wore it, something that spoke to his natural resilience and adaptability. He walked straight to the wagon with the purposeful stride of someone with important business to conduct. The boy picked up a hammer from the wagon bed, holding it with both small hands in an unconscious mimicry of the stance he had seen men use. His face was serious, concentrated, as if he was memorizing the tool's weight and balance for future reference. There was something touching about his determination, the way he studied everything around him with the careful attention of a child who had learned that the world could change without warning. Samuel looked down at the ball, and Rebecca saw something flicker across his face like summer lightning. Pain, memory, something deeper and more complicated than simple kindness. For a moment, his carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing glimpses of a man who carried wounds that had never properly healed, scars that went deeper than anything visible on his weathered skin. Then Danny smiled, the first genuine smile Rebecca had seen from her son in months, and Samuel's face went carefully blank again. But she had seen enough in that unguarded moment to understand that whatever debt Samuel Mitchell thought he owed, whatever connection existed between him and her dead husband, it ran deeper than simple neighborly obligation. "We work," she said, making her decision with the same sudden certainties that had driven her to build her cabin alone. "Partnership, not charity." Samuel studied her face for a long moment, as if weighing her words against some internal standard that only he could see. His gray eyes seemed to measure her resolve, testing whether she understood what she was committing herself to. Then he extended his hand, palms scarred and calloused from years of labor that no amount of wealth could eliminate. "Deal," he said. Rebecca took his hand, rough against rough, equal meeting equal. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, a recognition of strength meeting strength that was unlike anything she had experienced in her 3 years of widowhood. For so long she had carried her burdens alone, had faced every challenge with nothing but her own determination and stubborn pride. Now, for the first time, she felt the possibility of sharing that weight with someone who might actually be strong enough to bear it. His grip was firm without being crushing, respectful without being tentative. It was the handshake of a man who understood that agreements made between equals carried more weight than any legal document. That reputation and word were the only currencies that truly mattered in a place where law was often hundreds of miles away. "You know carpentry?" Samuel asked, releasing her hand with what might have been reluctance. "I learned fast," Rebecca replied, her voice gaining strength with each word. "And I don't quit." The corner of his mouth twitched again, that almost smile that seemed to be his primary concession to humor. "Good," he said, "neither do I." They stood in the cold morning, the contract made without lawyers or paperwork or any of the elaborate rituals that mark such agreements in more civilized places. Here, on the edge of the frontier, a person's word was their bond, and breaking it meant more than just legal consequences. It meant exile from the community of decent people, a fate worse than poverty in a land where cooperation often meant the difference between life and death. Behind them, a buggy rolled past on the distant road that connected Cold Creek to the outside world. Rebecca caught sight of Mrs. Adelaide from the mercantile, craning her neck to get a better view, her lips pursed in the tight line of moral disapproval that seemed to be her natural expression. The woman's sharp eyes missed nothing, cataloging every detail for later dissemination through the town's gossip network. Rebecca felt the familiar weight of watching eyes, the suffocating pressure of a community that measured every action against impossible standards of propriety. In a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where privacy was a luxury that few could afford, the simple act of accepting help from a wealthy man could be transformed into scandal through the alchemy of whispered speculation. Samuel noticed her distraction, following her gaze to the retreating buggy with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. He said nothing, but his silence was somehow more supportive than words would have been. Without comment, he handed her a saw, its handle worn smooth from years of use by hands that understood the relationship between tool and purpose. "Foundation first," he said, his voice carrying the authority of experience. "We start with what holds everything up." Rebecca took the saw, feeling its familiar weight settle into her palm like an old friend returning after a long absence. 3 years of building and rebuilding had made her comfortable with tools, had taught her that there was honesty in physical labor that could not be found in the elaborate social games that passed for civilization. Wood and nails didn't lie or judge it or carry tales to neighbors. They simply responded to skill and effort with results that could be measured and trusted. "Your word's all you got out here," James had once told her, back when the world was simpler and death seemed like something that happened to other people. "Break it, and you're worth less than dust." The memory was sharp enough to make her chest ache, but she pushed it aside and focused on the work ahead. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when there was so much to be done, and winter coming on with its promise of testing every decision they made today. They began to work, and Rebecca felt the rhythm of shared labor settle over them like a familiar blanket. Samuel proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to read the grain of wood for strength, how to identify the subtle differences between boards that would bear weight and those better suited for interior work. He demonstrated how to measure twice and cut once, the carpenter's fundamental rule that saved both time and materials. His hands moved with the confidence of long practice, marking measurements with precise strokes and cutting with the kind of accuracy that came from years of understanding that mistakes in Montana could be fatal. He showed her how to drive a nail straight without splitting the board, how to use her whole body strength rather than just her arm, how to feel the difference between wood that was properly seasoned and timber that would warp with the first change of weather. Danny fetched tools and held boards, his small hands growing increasingly skillful under Samuel's quiet instruction. The boy seemed to bloom under the rancher's attention like a flower turning towards sunlight, his natural intelligence finding outlet in the logical progression of building. Rebecca watched him tie knots under Samuel's guidance, saw him learn to read a level and mark measurements with increasing accuracy. There was something beautiful about watching her son discover his own capabilities, seeing confidence grow in his movements as he mastered each small task. For 3 years, Danny had been locked in silence, communicating only through his drawings and the occasional nod or shake of his head. But here, engaged in purposeful work alongside a man who treated him as a capable assistant rather than a fragile child, he was beginning to emerge from his self-imposed isolation. As the morning progressed, other neighbors passed on the road, some slowing their horses to stare openly at the unusual sight of the valley's wealthiest man working alongside its most notorious widow. Rebecca felt their eyes like physical weight, measuring and judging and finding her somehow wanting. But Samuel seemed oblivious to their attention, focused entirely on the work at hand with a concentration that excluded everything else. His indifference to gossip was both admirable and slightly terrifying. In a community where reputation was everything, where a single misstep could mean social exile, Samuel Mitchell moved through the world as if public opinion were irrelevant to his concerns. It was the confidence of a man who had learned that true strength came from within, that the judgments of others could only hurt you if you gave them permission to matter. By noon, they had laid out the foundation stakes with military precision and begun the laborious process of clearing debris from the building site. The work was hard, physical labor that left Rebecca's muscles aching and her hands raw despite 3 years of calluses. Splinters worked their way under her nails, and her back protested the constant bending and lifting required to sort through the wreckage of her former home. But there was satisfaction in it too, the deep pleasure that came from making something useful with your own hands, from imposing order on chaos through nothing more than will and effort. Each piece of salvageable lumber was a small victory. Each nail recovered from the debris a resource that wouldn't have to be purchased with money they didn't have. The destroyed cabin yielded surprising treasures as they worked. Her mother's china teapot, miraculously unbroken despite being buried under roof beams, a handful of silver coins that had been hidden in a coffee tin. James's old cavalry saber, tarnished but undamaged. Each discovery brought back memories, some painful, others bittersweet, all of them reminders that the past could not be completely erased by natural disaster. They broke for a simple meal of bread and dried meat, eating in the comfortable silence that had developed between them, like old friends who no longer needed words to communicate. Danny drew pictures in the dirt with a stick, sketching horses and buildings and men working together. His drawings had always been his way of processing the world, but today they seemed less melancholy, more hopeful. The boy's artistic talent was remarkable for someone so young. His sketches captured not just the physical details of what he observed, but something of the emotional weight as well. The horses in his drawings seemed to move with real energy, the buildings looked solid and welcoming, and the men working together conveyed a sense of purpose and cooperation that spoke to his deep need for family and security. "Built this barn 5 years ago," Samuel said suddenly, his knife moving in smooth, practiced strokes as he whittled a piece of pine. "For a wife." Rebecca looked up from mending a tear in Danny's shirt, needle poised in midair, like a conductor's baton frozen between movements. The words hung in the afternoon air, heavy with implications she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. Samuel continued working, his face giving nothing away, but his hands had stilled slightly, the rhythm of his whittling disrupted by memories that clearly still carried pain. "She left before the wedding," he said, his voice flat and controlled. "Said she couldn't handle the quiet, the isolation. Said I was married to the land, not to her." The confession was offered without drama, stated as simple fact rather than plea for sympathy. But Rebecca could hear the hurt beneath the careful neutrality, the wound that had never properly healed. She understood something about wounds like that, about the way loss could shape a person's life long after the immediate pain had faded. Was she right? Rebecca asked, her voice gentle despite the directness of the question. Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle jumping beneath the weathered skin. Maybe, he said, and resumed whittling with deliberate precision. Thin curls of wood fell to the ground at his feet like golden snow, each one perfect in its spiral perfection. I love teaching, Rebecca said quietly, offering her own painful memory in exchange for his honesty. Before James died, I had 23 students, taught them reading, arithmetic, geography. They called me Miss Rebecca, even after I married. The memory was bittersweet, filled with the yarn of young minds discovering the world through books and maps and careful instruction. She remembered the way their faces would light up when a difficult concept suddenly made sense, the pride in their voices when they read aloud successfully for the first time. Teaching had given her a purpose beyond mere survival, had made her feel useful in a way that nothing before or since had quite matched. "Why'd you stop?" Samuel asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Rebecca felt her throat tighten with familiar pain, the old wound opening as if it had never properly healed. "The town decided I brought bad luck. Parents pulled their children from my classroom one by one. Said they didn't want the curse to spread." The words came out bitter, flavored with 3 years of resentment and hurt. She remembered each parent who had come to collect their child, the awkward explanations and transparent excuses, the gradual emptying of her classroom until she was left teaching shadows and memories. The loss of her students had been almost as devastating as losing James, another death that left her world a little smaller and darker. Samuel's knife paused, and he looked at her directly with those gray eyes that seemed to see everything. "That's foolishness," he said, his voice carrying quiet conviction. "Maybe," Rebecca echoed his earlier words, testing their weight on her tongue. "But foolishness runs deep in small towns. Sometimes it's easier to believe in curses than face the truth that bad things happen to good people for no reason at all." They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in memories of loss and disappointment. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces, but there was a chill in the air that spoke of winter's approach, of the seasonal cycle that waited for no one's convenience. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent, having witnessed countless human dramas play out in their shadows. Danny looked up from his drawing, studying the adults with a serious expression that seemed to be his natural state. Without warning, he spoke, his voice rusty from disuse but clear enough to understand. "Will Mr. Samuel be my new papa?" The words hit the air like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of implication in all directions. Rebecca felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and something else, something dangerous that she wasn't ready to name. Samuel's whittling stopped entirely, his hands frozen as if the question had physically struck him. The silence stretched between them, filled with possibilities and fears and the weight of a child's innocent hope. Danny watched them both with the patient attention of someone waiting for an important answer, unaware that he had asked perhaps the most complicated question possible. Samuel cleared his throat and resumed his whittling, but Rebecca noticed that his hands were not quite steady. "I think," he said carefully, "that's a question for grown-ups to work out between themselves. Right now we're all just friends helping each other." It was a diplomatic answer, neither encouraging nor discouraging Danny's hope, while avoiding the deeper implications of his question. But Rebecca could see the tension in Samuel's shoulders, the careful way he avoided looking directly at either of them. The question had shaken him more than he was willing to admit. Danny seemed to accept this explanation, returning to his drawing with the resilience of childhood. But Rebecca found herself studying Samuel's profile, wondering what lay beneath his careful composure. Was he thinking about the woman who had left him? Was he considering the complications that would come from any relationship with the valley's most scandalous widow? Or was he simply trying to maintain the careful distance that had kept him safe for 5 years? The afternoon wore on, and they made steady progress on clearing the building site. Samuel worked with the easy competence of a man who had built things before, who understood the relationship between planning and execution. He showed Rebecca how to sort lumber by quality, how to identify boards that would bear weight and those better suited for interior work. Every lesson was practical, grounded in the hard-earned knowledge that came from years of frontier living. His teaching style was patient but demanding, expecting her to remember what she had learned and apply it correctly. He didn't coddle her or make allowances for her gender, treating her as he would any apprentice who needed to master essential skills. Rebecca found this approach refreshing after 3 years of being treated as either helpless or dangerous, depending on the observer's perspective. As they worked, Samuel shared stories of building projects he had undertaken over the years, each tale carrying practical lessons about materials and techniques and the importance of planning ahead. He spoke of barns that had collapsed because corners were cut, of houses that had burned because chimneys were improperly constructed, of foundations that had shifted because the builders hadn't properly understood the soil they were building on. Every mistake teaches you something, he said, examining a board for warping. The expensive ones make sure you don't forget the lesson. His philosophy was pragmatic, grounded in the understanding that perfection was less important than competence, that a building which stood for 50 years was better than one which looked perfect but collapsed in the first storm. It was the wisdom of a man who had learned to measure success by survival rather than appearance. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to set the world on fire, a rider appeared on the road from town. Rebecca recognized him immediately, and her heart sank with the weight of inevitability. Banker Morrison rode with his careful posture of someone unaccustomed to horseback, his city clothes marking him as clearly as a uniform in this land of practical garments and functional accessories. Morrison was a thin man, with pale eyes and the kind of weak chin that suggested character to match. He had arrived in Cold Creek 2 years ago with Eastern credentials and big city ideas about how a frontier bank should operate. His methods were aggressive, his terms harsh, and his sympathies non-existent for those who fell behind on their obligations. Morrison dismounted awkwardly near their worksite, nearly losing his balance as his horse shifted unexpectedly. He approached with the cautious air of a man entering potentially hostile territory, his gaze sweeping over the lumber, the tools, the evidence of industry and cooperation. Rebecca could see disapproval gathering in his features like storm clouds building on the horizon. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, touching his hat brim, in a gesture that managed to be both polite and condescending. "Or Mitchell, I heard about the storm damage. Terrible business, truly terrible." His voice carried the false sympathy of a professional mourner, someone who had learned to mimic human emotion for business purposes. Rebecca had heard that tone before, usually just before receiving news that would make her situation worse. "Mr. Morrison," Rebecca replied, keeping her voice carefully neutral, despite the anxiety building in her chest. "I wanted to speak with you about your financial obligations," Morrison continued, reaching into his coat pocket with the flourish of a magician about to reveal his most impressive trick. "The bank holds a note on your property, and given the circumstances of recent events," he produced a folded document with obvious pride, as if he had been practicing the gesture for maximum dramatic effect. Rebecca's heart sank as she recognized the legal language of foreclosure proceedings, the cold bureaucratic words that could strip away everything she had worked to build. But as she scanned the paper, something struck her as fundamentally wrong. The signature at the bottom, supposedly hers, was close but not quite right. The R in Rebecca was formed differently than she wrote it, the loops too large and the slant too steep. The overall flow of the signature was subtly different from her natural handwriting, as if someone had practiced copying it but hadn't quite mastered the nuances. "This signature," she said slowly, studying the document more carefully while her mind raced through the implications. "This isn't mine." Morrison's face flushed slightly, color creeping up his neck like rising water. "I'm sure you're mistaken, Mrs. Thompson. Legal documents are carefully verified before—" "I know my own signature," Rebecca interrupted, her voice gaining strength as anger began to burn away fear. "This is a forgery." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Morrison's composure cracked slightly, revealing glimpses of the nervous man beneath the professional facade. His hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he reached for the document, but Samuel stepped closer before he could reclaim it. Without a word, Samuel plucked the paper from Rebecca's hands and examined it with the careful attention of a man who had learned to read more than just words on a page. His gray eyes grew cold as winter stone, And when he looked up at Morrison, there was something predatory in his expression that made the banker take an involuntary step backward. "Interesting," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that preceded violence. "Very interesting indeed." Morrison shifted uncomfortably, his city breeding no match for the quiet menace that seemed to radiate from Samuel like heat from a forge. His mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, like a fish pulled suddenly from water and struggling to breathe air. "Now see here, Mitchell," he finally managed to stammer. "The bank has every right to pursue legitimate collection efforts when borrowers default on their obligations." "The bank," Samuel said, his voice cutting through Morrison's bluster like a blade through silk, "has the right to collect legitimate debts with legitimate documentation. Fraud, on the other hand, is a federal offense in the territories." The words carried weight that went beyond mere legal technicality. In a place where law enforcement was sparse and justice often took unconventional forms, accusations of fraud were serious business. Morrison's face had gone pale, and his hands trembled more noticeably as he reached for the document. But Samuel held it just out of reach, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "I think I'll hold on to this," he said with deceptive mildness. "For safekeeping, evidence has a way of disappearing when people get nervous." Morrison opened and closed his mouth several more times, producing sounds that might have been attempts at words but came out more like gasps. Finally, he managed to stammer something about checking bank records and possible clerical errors before mounting his horse with undignified haste and riding back toward town at a pace that suggested panic rather than purpose. Rebecca stared after him, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. A forged foreclosure notice meant someone had been planning to steal her land, had been waiting for an opportunity like the storm to make their move with legal cover. But who would go to such elaborate lengths for her small homestead? And why forge her signature when a legitimate foreclosure would have been simpler to arrange? "Who would want my land?" she asked aloud, voicing the question that seemed most urgent. Samuel's expression had grown thoughtful, distant, as if he was working through a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together. He folded the forged document carefully and slipped it into his pocket for safekeeping. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned knowledge about human nature and the various forms that greed could take. "Someone who wants more than just your few acres," he said grimly. "Someone who's playing a longer game than simple land acquisition." That night, after Danny had fallen asleep, Samuel sat staring into the fire with the weight of unspoken truths heavy on his shoulders. Rebecca could see the struggle in his weathered features, the way his hands clenched and unclenched, as if fighting an internal battle. "There's something you need to know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "About your husband, about why I really owe him everything." Rebecca set aside her mending, sensing this was the moment she had been waiting for since their first meeting. "Tell me." Samuel was quiet for so long she thought he might have changed his mind. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, painfully, like drawing poison from an infected wound. "I served under Captain David Thompson in the Apache campaigns 5 years ago," he began. "I was a scout then, bitter and angry at the world. When word came of an Apache settlement in Devil's Canyon, I volunteered to guide the cavalry there." His gray eyes reflected the firelight like tears unshed. "I told them it was a war party. I convinced Captain Thompson that we'd find warriors, weapons, threat to settlers. But when we rode into that canyon at dawn," his voice broke completely. Rebecca felt ice form in her stomach. "Samuel, there were no warriors, just families. Women grinding corn, children playing by the stream, old men telling stories. I had led 60 armed soldiers to slaughter innocents because I wanted revenge for raids I couldn't prove they'd committed." The confession hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Rebecca could barely breathe as the implications sank in. The man she was beginning to care for, the man who had saved her and Danny, carried the weight of mass murder on his soul. "Captain Thompson ordered the men to stand down," Samuel continued, his voice hollow with remembered horror. "But some of the younger soldiers, they'd already started shooting. By the time he regained control, 7 Apache were dead, 3 of them children." Rebecca closed her eyes, seeing the scene as clearly as if she had been there. David, her gentle David, forced to witness such brutality, forced to live with the knowledge that men under his command had killed innocents. "Your husband arrested me on the spot," Samuel said. "Court-martial for providing false intelligence. Conduct unbecoming. Half a dozen other charges. I was ready to hang for what I'd done. Wanted to hang. But David," his voice softened with something approaching reverence, "he came to see me in the stockade the night before my trial." Samuel reached into his shirt and pulled out a worn piece of paper, folded and refolded so many times the creases had become permanent. "He gave me this, a letter he'd written to you but never sent, about second chance, about how a man's worst moment doesn't have to define his entire life." Rebecca's hands trembled as she recognized David's handwriting on the weathered paper. Her husband's words, written from a place of pain and struggling with his own complicity in the tragedy. "He testified at my trial," Samuel continued, "not to excuse what I'd done, but to argue that punishment without the possibility of redemption was just another kind of cruelty. He convinced the tribunal to sentence me to dismissal from service rather than execution, on condition that I spend my life making amends." The pieces were falling into place now, the mystery of Samuel's wealth and isolation finally making sense. "The Apache, you've been helping them." Samuel nodded. "Every cent I've made from this ranch goes to support the families I helped destroy. White Eagle's grandson, the boy I saved from drowning, his father was killed in Devil's Canyon because of me. I've spent 5 years trying to atone there for 5 minutes of hatred." Rebecca felt her world reorganizing itself around this new knowledge. The man she had begun to love was both monster and saint, destroyer and protector, carrying wounds that would never fully heal. "David made me promise something else," Samuel said, his eyes meeting hers across the dying fire. "He made me swear that if anything ever happened to him, I would watch over his family. Not interfere, not impose, just watch. Make sure you and Danny were safe." The tears came then, hot and sudden, as Rebecca finally understood the depth of David's love for her. Even facing his own mortality in a hostile land, her husband had been thinking of her welfare, arranging protection she would never know existed until she needed it most. "That's why you were on the ridge that morning," she whispered. "Why you had supplies ready. You've been keeping that promise for 3 years." "I tried to stay away," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "Tried to honor his wish that I not interfere unless absolutely necessary. But watching you struggle alone, watching Danny retreat into silence, it was killing me by inches." As if summoned by their conversation about hidden motivations and secret schemes, another rider appeared on the horizon, moving with the purposeful gait of someone who had specific business to conduct. This time, Rebecca recognized the newcomer immediately, and her heart sank even further. If Morrison had been the messenger bringing bad news, this man was likely to be the architect of whatever plan was unfolding around them. Douglas Hartwell was everything that Morrison was not. Confident, commanding, completely comfortable in the saddle. The valley's second largest landowner after Samuel, he was a man who collected property the way other men collected horses or cattle, always looking for opportunities to expand his holdings through legitimate purchase or more creative means. He rode with the easy authority of someone accustomed to getting his way, his expensive clothes and well-groomed appearance marking him as successful even at a distance. Where Morrison inspired contempt, Hartwell commanded a grudging sort of respect, the kind given to predators who were honest about their nature. He was known for his sharp dealings and his ability to acquire struggling farms at prices that benefited him more than the sellers, but he was also known for honoring his agreements once made. It was a reputation that made him dangerous in a different way than simple dishonesty would have been. Hartwell dismounted with fluid grace, his movements those of a man equally comfortable in a boardroom or the saddle. His eyes swept over their construction site with the calculating gaze of someone who saw opportunities where others saw problems, who could assess the value and potential of any piece of property with mathematical precision. "Mitchell," he called out as he approached, his voice carrying the hearty false friendliness of a practiced politician. "Mrs. Thompson, terrible thing about the storm. Absolutely terrible. Nature can be so cruel to those least able to bear her fury." His words were carefully chosen, expressing sympathy while subtly emphasizing Rebecca's vulnerable position. It was the rhetorical equivalent of a chess move, appearing supportive while actually establishing dominance. Rebecca felt Samuel tense beside her, though his expression remained neutral. I hear there might be some question about property ownership, Hartwell continued, his tone suggesting casual interest rather than specific knowledge. Legal complications can be so troublesome, especially for a widow with limited resources and winter approaching. The observation was delivered with apparent concern, but Rebecca could hear the predatory interest beneath the surface. Hartwell was not the kind of man to make social calls without purpose, and his timing was too perfect to be coincidental. If he was here within hours of Morrison's visit, it meant he had been watching, waiting, perhaps even orchestrating events. No complications, Rebecca said firmly, drawing strength from Samuel's presence beside her. Just some paperwork irregularities that will be sorted out soon enough. Hartwell's smile was warm and reassuring, the expression of a man offering help to neighbors in distress. But his eyes remained cold, calculating, measuring her resistance with the patience of a natural predator. Of course, he said smoothly. But if you should find yourself in need of a quick resolution, I'd be happy to make a fair offer for the property. Cash on the table, no lawyers or lengthy proceedings. Sometimes a clean break is best for everyone involved, don't you think? The offer was smooth, reasonable, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Hartwell was not the kind of man to make spontaneous gestures of neighborly assistance. If he was here with a prepared offer within hours of the forged foreclosure attempt, it meant the entire sequence had been planned. Morrison's clumsy fraud was just the opening move in a more sophisticated game. That's very generous, Rebecca said carefully, her voice steady despite the fear building in her chest. But I'm not interested in selling. Think it over, Hartwell replied easily, his manner suggesting infinite patience rather awe than pressure. No rush, of course, but winter's coming on fast, and rebuilding takes time and money that you may not have. Sometimes the practical choice isn't the one our hearts prefer, but it's the one that ensures survival. The words carried veiled threat beneath their surface reasonableness. He was reminding her of her vulnerability without directly threatening her, offering salvation while implying doom if she refused. It was expertly done, the work of someone who understood how to apply pressure without leaving fingerprints. He remounted with the same fluid grace he had shown in dismounting, but before turning his horse toward town, he fixed Samuel with a look that carried unmistakable meaning. Two predators recognizing each other across disputed territory, each measuring the other's strength and resolve. Mitchell, he said, touching his hat brim in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and mocking. Always a pleasure to see you taking such personal interest in community welfare. Give my regards to your guests. The emphasis on the last word was slight but unmistakable, a reminder that nothing in Cold Creek Valley went unnoticed, that every action would be measured and judged by the community's unforgiving standards. Then he was gone, riding back toward town with the satisfied air of a man who had accomplished his purpose. Rebecca and Samuel stood in silence, watching until Hartwell disappeared into the gathering dusk. The temperature was dropping fast with the sun's descent, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky like distant diamonds scattered across black velvet. Danny had fallen asleep against a pile of lumber, exhausted by the day's excitement and activity. He knew, Rebecca said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, about the foreclosure notice. He was ready for it. Samuel nodded grimly, his jaw set in lines of anger and determination. More than ready. This whole thing has been orchestrated from the beginning. But why? What's so special about my few acres that would justify such elaborate schemes? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains where snow gleamed silver in the starlight, like a promise of harder times to come. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned knowledge about the way power operated in places where law was still more hope than reality. Water, he said simply, the single word containing volumes of explanation. The implications hit Rebecca like a physical blow, pieces of a puzzle suddenly falling into place with devastating clarity. Your property sits on the headwaters of Willowby Creek, Samuel continued, his voice grim with understanding. Control that, and you can control every farm downstream. Hartwell's been buying up land along the creek for 2 years now, paying premium prices for places that should be worthless by any reasonable measure. But if he owns the source, Rebecca felt the world shift beneath her feet as she finally understood the true scope of what they were facing. Her small homestead, which she had always considered barely valuable enough to justify the backbreaking work of farming it, was actually the key to controlling water rights for half the valley. With Montana's increasing settlement and the growing importance of irrigation for agriculture, those rights could be worth a fortune to the right person. "He's been waiting for me to fail," she said, the pieces of 3 years of struggle suddenly making sense in a new and terrifying way. "The storm was a gift," Samuel corrected, his voice hard with anger. "But he would have found another way eventually. Men like Hartwell always do. They're patient as snakes, willing to wait for the perfect opportunity rather than force their hand prematurely." Danny stirred in his sleep, mumbling something unintelligible about horses and houses. Rebecca knelt beside him, brushing dirt from his clothes and checking to make sure he was warm enough as the temperature continued to drop. The boy looked so young in sleep, so vulnerable, and she felt the familiar surge of protective instinct that had driven her through 3 years of struggle against impossible odds. "What do we do?" she asked, looking up at Samuel with eyes that demanded honesty rather than false comfort. Samuel looked down at her kneeling beside her sleeping son, and something shifted in his expression. The careful neutrality he maintained like armor cracked slightly, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the protective facade. There was strength there, and determination, but also something else, something that looked dangerously like caring. "We build," he said firmly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "We build something strong enough to last, and we dare them to try to tear it down." The words carried more than just practical meaning about construction and materials. They were talking about making a stand, about refusing to be driven away by men who thought power and money gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. It was a declaration of war against forces that had seemed insurmountable just hours before. "It won't be easy," Rebecca said, voicing the fear that gnawed at her despite her growing determination. Samuel's almost smile appeared again, barely visible in the growing darkness, but somehow more reassuring than any elaborate speech could have been. "Nothing worth doing ever is," he said simply. He helped her gather Danny in her arms, the boy's small weight settling against her chest with the trusting ease of childhood. Together they walked toward the barn, leaving the construction site behind for another day of labor and planning. Tomorrow they would begin building in earnest, laying down roots that Hartwell and his schemes could not easily dislodge. But as they settled in for another night in the barn, Rebecca could not shake the feeling that they had crossed some invisible line today, that by accepting Samuel's help and acknowledging the forces arrayed against them, she had committed herself to a course of action that would demand everything she had to give and more besides. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the promise of another storm. But inside the barn, surrounded by warmth and the quiet presence of a man who had proven himself trustworthy in ways both large and small, Rebecca found herself looking forward to tomorrow's challenges rather than dreading them. For the first time in 3 years, she was not facing an uncertain future alone. And that single fact, she was beginning to realize, made all the difference in the world between mere survival and the possibility of something that might actually deserve to be called living. The wooden horse that Danny clutched in his sleep seemed to glow in the lamplight, a symbol of craftsmanship and care that promised better days ahead. If Samuel Mitchell was willing to stand with her against whatever Hartwell and his allies could bring to bear, then perhaps her long run of misfortune was finally coming to an end. Perhaps it was time to stop running from her reputation as a woman who brought bad luck and start building something worth defending. Something that would prove once and for all that curses were just stories people told to explain away their own failures of courage and imagination. The second week of December brought with it a cold that seemed to settle in the very bones of the earth, the kind of bitter chill that made every breath visible and turned simple tasks into tests of endurance. Rebecca woke each morning to find ice crystals covering the inside of the barn windows, delicate patterns that spoke of the brutal winter that had Montana territory in its grip. But despite the cold, despite the challenges that seemed to multiply with each passing day, the work continued. The foundation of her new cabin was taking shape with methodical precision, each stone carefully selected and placed according to Samuel's exacting standards. He had insisted on using local granite quarried from the hillside behind his property, rather than the easier option of timber footings that most homesteaders favored. "Build it to last," he had said, his gray eyes serious as winter storm clouds. "Build it so strong that nothing short of the earth itself moving can knock it down." The advice carried weight beyond mere construction philosophy. In the 2 weeks since Morrison's failed foreclosure attempt, the pressure from Hartwell had intensified in ways both subtle and obvious. Suppliers in town had suddenly become reluctant to extend credit to Rebecca, citing concerns about her ability to pay. The general store had stopped carrying certain items she needed, claiming supply problems that seemed to affect only her orders. Even the blacksmith, normally a straightforward man who cared more about payment than politics, had begun charging her premium prices for basic hardware. It was economic warfare waged with the precision of a military campaign, designed to force her into bankruptcy without leaving obvious fingerprints. Hartwell was squeezing from every direction, using his influence and resources to make her situation impossible, while maintaining plausible deniability about his involvement. It was the work of a man who understood that in a small community, economic pressure could be more effective than direct confrontation. But Samuel's presence changed the equation in ways that Hartwell had perhaps not fully anticipated. When suppliers hesitated to deal with Rebecca, they found themselves facing questions about their treatment of Samuel Mitchell's business associate. When prices mysteriously increased for her orders, Samuel would appear to personally oversee transactions, his quiet presence ensuring that normal rates applied. His wealth and influence created a protective barrier around her that Hartwell could not easily penetrate. The arrangement was delicate, requiring careful navigation of social expectations and community gossip. Samuel could not be seen as directly supporting a widow without fueling speculation about their relationship, but he could legitimately conduct business with a partner in a construction project. The distinction was subtle but crucial in a place where reputation could be destroyed by careless whispers. Rebecca had learned to read the signs of community judgment with the skill of a weather prophet interpreting storm clouds. She saw it in the way conversations stopped when she entered the mercantile, in the careful distance that other women maintained at church, in the sidelong glances that followed her movements through town. But she also saw something else, a growing respect from those who recognized the quality of work being done on her property and the determination she showed in facing adversity. The cabin was rising from its foundation with a solidity that impressed even the most skeptical observers. Samuel's teaching had made Rebecca genuinely skilled at carpentry, able to cut joints and raise beams with confidence that came from understanding rather than mere instruction following. Danny had become an accomplished assistant, able to anticipate needs and provide help with the efficiency of someone much older. On this particular morning, as Rebecca prepared mortar for the day's stonework, she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching from the direction of town. Through the barn door, she could see a group of 6 men riding toward the construction site, their purposeful movements suggesting business rather than casual visitation. Samuel emerged from the house, alerted by the same sounds, his hand resting casually on the Colt revolver that he had taken to wearing since the troubles began. The lead rider was Sheriff Coleman, a weathered man in his 50s who had held the position for nearly a decade through a combination of competence and political neutrality. Behind him rode Deputy Martinez, young and eager, followed by 4 men Rebecca didn't immediately recognize. Their clothes and bearing marked them as outsiders, probably territorial officials summoned to deal with whatever legal complications Hartwell had manufactured. "Morning, Mrs. Thompson. Mr. Mitchell," Coleman called out as the group drew near. His voice carried the careful formality of a man conducting official business, but Rebecca caught undertones of apology that suggested he was not entirely comfortable with his mission. "Sheriff," Samuel replied evenly, his stance relaxed but ready. "What brings you out this way?" Coleman dismounted and approached with the measured steps of someone delivering news that no one wanted to hear. He carried a leather document case that seemed to weigh more than its physical mass would suggest. "I'm afraid this isn't a social call," he said, his weathered face showing genuine regret. "Got some papers from the territorial court that need serving." He opened the case and withdrew a thick bundle of legal documents, their official seals and ribbons marking them as serious business from the territorial capital. Rebecca's heart sank as she recognized the format of court proceedings, the elaborate language that transformed human conflicts into abstract legal puzzles. Mrs. Thompson, Coleman continued, you're being sued for breach of contract and fraud in connection with your property dealings. Mr. Hartwell claims you've defaulted on certain agreements and owes his investment group substantial damages. The words hit Rebecca like physical blows, each legal phrase another stone in a wall of accusation and implication. She had expected Hartwell to escalate his campaign, but the speed and scope of this legal assault was breathtaking. Somehow he had manufactured a complex civil case designed to tie her up in court proceedings she could neither afford nor navigate alone. Samuel stepped forward and examined the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood legal language. His face grew increasingly grim as he read, and Rebecca could see anger building behind his controlled expression. This is creative, he said finally, his voice carrying dangerous quiet. Hartwell's claiming she agreed to sell water rights in exchange for development capital that was never provided. That's impossible, Rebecca protested, her voice sharp with outrage. I never signed any agreement with Hartwell. I've never even spoken to him about water rights or development or anything else. Coleman nodded sympathetically. That may be true, ma'am, but the court's got to sort that out. In the meantime, there's an injunction preventing any further development of the property until the matter's resolved. You'll need to stop construction immediately. The injunction was a masterstroke of legal maneuvering, Rebecca realized with growing despair. Even if she could eventually prove the contracts were fraudulent, the legal process would take months during which she would be unable to complete her cabin before winter's worst months. Without shelter, she would be forced to accept charity or leave the territory altogether, effectively accomplishing Hartwell's goals without a court ever ruling on the merits of his case. There's more, Coleman continued reluctantly. There's also a petition for emergency guardianship of the boy, claims that living conditions are unsafe and that the child's welfare is at risk. The second attack was even more devastating than the first. Rebecca felt the world spin around her as the implications sank in. Hartwell was not just trying to steal her land, he was trying to take her son. The legal system that was supposed to protect families was being twisted into a weapon against everything she held dear. Danny, who had been working quietly nearby, looked up with wide eyes that held too much understanding for a child his age. He had already lost one parent to circumstances beyond his control. The possibility of losing his mother to legal machinations was almost too cruel to contemplate. That's outrageous, Samuel said, his carefully controlled temper finally showing cracks. The boy is well cared for, well fed, receiving education. There's no basis for emergency action. I'm just serving papers, Mr. Mitchell, Coleman replied, his discomfort obvious. The court will make the final determination. But in the meantime, the boy needs to be placed in temporary custody pending a full hearing. The moment crystallized around Rebecca like ice forming on still water. Everything she had fought for, everything she had built, was being stripped away by legal documents and bureaucratic procedures. Hartwell had found a way to use the system itself as a weapon, turning laws meant to protect people into tools of oppression. But as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she felt Samuel's hands settle on her shoulder, warm and strong and absolutely steady. When she looked up at his face, she saw something that took her breath away. Not just anger, but the kind of cold determination that moved mountains. Sheriff, Samuel said, his voice carrying absolute authority, I invoke territorial marriage law, Section 12. Coleman's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Mr. Mitchell, are you saying? I'm saying that Mrs. Thompson has accepted my proposal of marriage, Samuel continued, his eyes never leaving Rebecca's face. As her intended husband, I claim legal standing in these proceedings and assume financial responsibility for her defense. The declaration hit the assembled group like a thunderbolt. Rebecca stared at Samuel in shock, her mind racing to process what had just happened. He had not asked her opinion, had not consulted her wishes, but had simply declared their engagement as a legal strategy to protect her and Danny from Hartwell's assault. It was a desperate gambit, she realized, born of necessity rather than romance. Under territorial law, an engaged woman gains certain legal protections, and her intended husband could act as her legal representative in court proceedings. It was an archaic system that treated women as property to be protected by male relatives. But in this case, it might be the only thing standing between her family and destruction. "Is this true, Mrs. Thompson?" Coleman asked, his voice careful and formal. Rebecca looked at Samuel, seeing the question in his gray eyes despite the certainty in his voice. He was offering her protection, offering to stand against Hartwell's legal and financial power with everything he possessed. But the offer came with a price: marriage to a man she barely knew, regardless of her own feelings or desires. The alternative was losing everything, including Danny. When viewed in that light, the choice became simple. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "It's true." Coleman nodded and made notes on his documents. "That does complicate things legally," he admitted. "I'll need to send word back to the territorial court about this development. In the meantime, the construction injunction still stands, but the guardianship petition will need to be reviewed in light of the changed circumstances." It was a partial victory, enough to buy them time but not enough to resolve the larger conflict. Hartwell would undoubtedly escalate further, finding new legal angles to attack from. But they had gained breathing space, and sometimes that was enough to turn the tide of a desperate situation. After the sheriff and his men departed, Rebecca and Samuel stood in awkward silence, the weight of their sudden engagement settling between them like a wall. Danny approached cautiously, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. "Are you really going to marry Mr. Samuel?" the boy asked with the directness that only children possessed. Rebecca looked at Samuel, seeing uncertainty beneath his confident facade. "It's complicated, sweetheart," she said finally. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult decisions to protect the people they care about." Samuel knelt down to Danny's level, his expression serious but gentle. "I made your mama a promise to keep you both safe," he said. "Sometimes keeping promises requires making sacrifices." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another rider, this one approaching from the direction of the Mitchell ranch house. Rebecca recognized the horse before she could make out the rider. Samuel's foreman, Jake Morrison, a grizzled veteran who had worked the ranch for 20 years. His face carried urgent news as he dismounted and approached Samuel. "Boss," Morrison said without preamble, "we got problems. Someone's been cutting fence lines along the eastern pasture. Lost about 50 head of cattle overnight. They drove them off toward Hartwell's land." The cattle rustling was another escalation in Hartwell's campaign, Rebecca realized with growing alarm. He was no longer content with legal maneuvering. He was moving into outright theft and intimidation. The missing cattle represented thousands of dollars in lost value, money that Samuel would need for the legal battles ahead. Samuel's jaw tightened as he absorbed the news. "Any tracks? Any sign of who did it?" "Nothing definitive," Morrison replied, "but the cuts were clean, professional. This wasn't some drifters looking for easy money. This was planned." The systematic nature of the attack confirmed Rebecca's worst fears. Hartwell was escalating to open warfare, using methods that skirted the edge of legality while inflicting maximum economic damage. Samuel was being forced to choose between protecting his own interests and defending hers, a calculation that Hartwell undoubtedly hoped would drive a wedge between them. "Double the night watch," Samuel instructed Morrison, "and send word to Sheriff Coleman about the missing cattle. Make sure everything goes through official channels." Morrison nodded and rode back toward the ranch, leaving Rebecca and Samuel alone with the weight of escalating conflict. The morning that had begun with hope and determination now felt heavy with the promise of harder battles ahead. "I'm sorry," Rebecca said quietly. "I never wanted to drag you into this." Samuel turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious but not angry. "You didn't drag me anywhere. I chose to be here. But the cattle, the money you're losing?" "Money can be replaced," Samuel interrupted. "Some things can't." The words carried implications that neither of them was quite ready to explore. Their engagement might have begun as a legal strategy, but there were undercurrents of genuine feeling that complicated the simple transaction they had intended. Rebecca found herself studying Samuel's face, looking for clues about his true feelings beneath the protective facade he maintained. Before she could probe deeper, the sound of wagon wheels announced another arrival. This time it was Father Miguel from the Territorial Mission, an elderly priest who served the scattered communities throughout the region. His presence was unexpected but not unwelcome. Father Miguel was known for his wisdom and his ability to navigate complex human problems. My children, the priest called out as he climbed down from his wagon, his weathered face creased with concern. I heard about your troubles in town. I came to see if there was anything I could do to help. Father Miguel was a small man, barely 5.5 feet tall, but he carried himself with the dignity of someone who had faced down more than his share of human cruelty and emerged with his faith intact. He had been ministering to frontier communities for 30 years, marrying couples, baptizing children, and burying the dead with equal grace and compassion. Father, Samuel said, inclining his head respectfully, thank you for coming. I understand there has been talk of marriage, the priest continued, his sharp eyes taking in the tension between Rebecca and Samuel. In my experience, marriages born of necessity can become marriages of love if the people involved are patient and honest with each other. Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks at the priest's direct approach to their situation. There was no point in pretending that their engagement was conventional romance. Father Miguel had undoubtedly heard the circumstances from sources in town. We're still working out the details, she said carefully. Of course, Father Miguel replied with a knowing smile. But perhaps you would permit an old man to offer some advice. The legal ceremony can happen quickly if needed, but a marriage of hearts takes time to develop. Don't feel pressured to rush either one beyond what wisdom dictates. It was a diplomatic way of acknowledging that they might need a quick legal marriage for protection while allowing time for genuine feelings to develop. Father Miguel's long experience with frontier marriages had taught him that practical partnerships often evolved into loving relationships if given proper care and attention. There's something else, the priest continued, his expression growing more serious. I've been hearing troubling things about certain business practices in the territory. Questions about land deals and water rights that may not be entirely legal. The territorial governor is sending an investigator to look into these matters. The news was potentially game-changing, Rebecca realized with a surge of hope. If federal authorities were investigating Hartwell's business practices, it might expose the entire conspiracy that had targeted her property. A territorial investigation would carry more weight than local court proceedings and could not be influenced by Hartwell's local connections. When? Samuel asked. Soon, Father Miguel replied. Within the month, I'm told. Of course, these investigations can take time, and there's no guarantee what they'll discover. But it might be wise to document everything that's happened, to be prepared if called upon to testify. The priest's suggestion was sound tactical advice. If they could present a compelling case to territorial investigators, they might be able to turn the entire situation around. But first, they needed to survive long enough for help to arrive. The afternoon was spent in intense discussion about strategy and tactics. Samuel proved to have a deep understanding of territorial law and politics, knowledge gained from his own business dealings and from contacts in the territorial capital. Rebecca contributed her intimate knowledge of Hartwell's recent actions and her growing understanding of the water rights situation. Danny helped by drawing maps and diagrams that illustrated the property relationships and water flow patterns. His artistic skills made complex geographical relationships clear and understandable, providing visual evidence that could be valuable in any legal proceedings. As evening approached, they had assembled a comprehensive picture of Hartwell's conspiracy and developed a plan for fighting back. It would require careful coordination and considerable courage. But for the first time since the crisis began, Rebecca felt genuinely hopeful about their chances. The plan was interrupted by the arrival of yet another unexpected visitor. This time it was Marcus White Eagle, an Apache chief who had maintained peaceful relations with the territorial government for over a decade. He rode alone, carrying himself with the dignity of someone who commanded respect through character rather than force. Samuel's reaction to White Eagle's arrival was complex, Rebecca observed. There was respect there, but also something that might have been guilt or regret. The two men greeted each other with formal courtesy that suggested a shared history neither was eager to discuss in detail. Mitchell, White Eagle said in English, heavily accented but perfectly clear, I heard about your troubles. I came to repay an old debt. The words carried weight that went beyond simple neighborly assistance. Rebecca sensed undercurrents of meaning that dated back years, perhaps to Samuel's military service or early days in the territory. White Eagle's presence transformed the conflict from a local dispute into something with broader implications. "You don't owe me anything," Samuel replied quietly. "I owe you my grandson's life," White Eagle corrected with simple dignity. "That is not a debt that time erases." The conversation continued in a mixture of English and Spanish that Rebecca could partially follow. From what she could understand, Samuel had once saved White Eagle's grandson from drowning during a river crossing gone wrong. The rescue had been made at considerable personal risk and had forged a bond between the two men that transcended their different cultures. Now White Eagle was offering assistance in their fight against Hartwell, bringing with him resources and knowledge that could prove invaluable. Apache scouts were legendary for their tracking abilities and their understanding of territorial geography. If cattle had been stolen, White Eagle's men could find evidence that others might miss. The offer of help came with its own complications. Association with Apache leaders, even peaceful ones, could be politically dangerous in a territory where memories of recent conflicts ran deep. But the potential benefits outweighed the risks, especially given the scope of Hartwell's assault on their interests. As darkness fell, they gathered in the barn to finalize their plans. The space that had been Rebecca's temporary shelter was now transformed into a kind of headquarters. Maps and documents spread across makeshift tables while oil lamps provided flickering illumination. Danny fell asleep in his corner, exhausted by the day's events, but somehow more secure than he had been in weeks. The planning session continued late into the night, three adults from very different backgrounds finding common ground in their shared determination to resist injustice. Samuel contributed his knowledge of law and business. Rebecca provided insight into Hartwell's tactics and motivations, and White Eagle offered practical wisdom about surviving conflicts with better-equipped opponents. By midnight, they had developed a comprehensive strategy that addressed both immediate threats and long-term goals. The plan was ambitious and risky, requiring perfect timing and considerable luck, but it offered the possibility of not just surviving Hartwell's assault, but actually defeating him decisively. The final element of their plan was perhaps the most dangerous. They would need to gather evidence of Hartwell's criminal activities, including the cattle rustling and document forgery. This would require someone to get close to his operation, to take risks that could result in serious injury or death if discovered. "I'll do it," Rebecca said when the need for infiltration became clear. "Absolutely not," Samuel replied immediately. "It's too dangerous." "I'm the only agent who can get close enough," Rebecca insisted. "Hartwell expects me to be desperate, maybe willing to negotiate. If I approach him with what looks like surrender, he might let his guard down enough for me to learn what we need to know." The argument continued for another hour, but eventually logic won out over protective instincts. Rebecca was indeed the only one who could credibly approach Hartwell without immediately arousing suspicion. Her apparent vulnerability was actually an advantage in this particular situation. The plan they finally settled on was complex and dangerous, requiring split-second timing and nerves of steel. But it offered their best chance of turning the tables on an opponent who seemed to hold all the advantages. If they could pull it off, Hartwell's conspiracy would be exposed and his power broken. If they failed, the consequences would be devastating for all involved. As the planning session wound down, Rebecca found herself alone with Samuel while White Eagle checked on his horses and Danny slept peacefully nearby. The temporary intimacy of the moment allowed for conversation that would have been impossible with others present. "About this morning," Samuel said quietly, referring to his sudden declaration of their engagement. "I should have asked you first." "You did what you had to do," Rebecca replied, though she felt compelled to be honest about her feelings. "But when this is over, when Hartwell is dealt with, we'll need to talk about what comes next." Samuel nodded, his expression serious in the lamplight. "I know this isn't how anyone dreams of getting engaged," he said, "but I want you to know that my feelings aren't just about legal convenience." The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest in a way that their desperate circumstances had not previously allowed. Rebecca felt her heart race as she recognized the truth in his words and acknowledged the matching feelings in her own chest. "Mine aren't either," she said softly. The moment was interrupted by White Eagle's return, but something fundamental had shifted between them. Their partnership had begun as necessity and evolved into something approaching genuine affection. Whether it could develop into lasting love remained to be seen, but for the first time, Rebecca allowed herself to hope that happiness might be possible even in the midst of crisis. The night was clear and cold, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. In a few hours, they would begin implementing their plan to defeat Hartwell and secure their future. The risks were enormous, but so was the potential reward. Not just survival, but the possibility of building something lasting and meaningful together. As Rebecca finally settled down to sleep, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that terrible morning when the storm had destroyed her cabin. She had lost her home but found a family. She had faced ruin but discovered strength she never knew she possessed. Most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the greatest victories came not from avoiding conflict, but from choosing the right battles and fighting them with courage and determination. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation with Hartwell and his conspiracy. But tonight, surrounded by people who cared about her welfare and protected by plans that offered real hope of success, Rebecca Thompson allowed herself to believe that better days lay ahead. The wooden horse that Danny clutched in his sleep caught the lamplight, its carved features seeming to smile with the promise of adventures yet to come. Outside, the Montana wind sang through the valley, carrying with it the whispered promise that even the longest winters eventually gave way to spring. 3 weeks later, the territorial investigator arrived as Father Miguel had promised. Marshal Jake Harrison was a no-nonsense man who had seen enough frontier corruption to recognize it immediately. White Eagle's testimony about Samuel's character, combined with the forged documents and stolen cattle evidence, painted a damning picture of Hartwell's conspiracy. The Sunday after Harrison's investigation concluded, Samuel walked to the front of Cold Creek's church uninvited. This time, Rebecca sat in the front pew, Danny beside her, both watching as the man they loved faced down an entire community's judgment. "You want to condemn us?" Samuel's voice carried to every corner of the church. "Then condemn me first. I've got blood on my hands from the Apache Wars. But David Thompson taught me that a man's past doesn't have to define his future." He looked directly at Rebecca, love clear in his gray eyes. "This woman has faced 3 years of your judgment with more grace than any of you showed her. She's raised her son alone, built her home with her own hands, and never asked for anything but the chance to live in peace." Half the congregation stood, led by the blacksmith and the schoolteacher. The other half remained seated, but their power was broken. 6 months later, as spring returned to Cold Creek Valley, Rebecca and Samuel were married in the same church where he had defended her honor. Danny served as ring bearer, his silence finally broken by laughter that filled the valley like birdsong. The cabin they built together stood strong against the Montana winds, its foundation deep and its walls true. But more importantly, they had built something that no storm could destroy, a family forged not by blood, but by choice, courage, and the kind of love that grows stronger under pressure. As Rebecca looked out over Willow Creek, watching Danny teach neighborhood children to fish while Samuel worked in their garden, she understood at last that curses were just stories weak people told to explain their own failures. Real strength came from standing up when the world tried to knock you down, from building something beautiful from the ruins of what came before. The wooden horse Samuel had carved for Danny sat on the mantel, a reminder that the most precious gifts were made by hand, with patience and love. Outside, the valley stretched green and endless under the Montana sky, full of promise and second chances for anyone brave enough to claim them.